This prisoner is trying to escape from prison. He untied his shoelaces and tied his wrists, presses his fingers on the table. He finds the right angle, clenches his teeth. He stomps his foot hard, his whole body jerked in pain. He breaks his thumb. He takes out another thin rope. One end was tied to the potion. The other end goes over his teeth. The bottle was angled in his mouth. He swallowed it straight into his esophagus. Then he disassembles the lighter. The flint is removed and hidden under the fingernail. The prisoner's name is Mike. He is a murderer with an IQ of 150. He was responsible for several deaths. He has escaped from prison several times, and this time, the opportunity finally came. The officer found him because the officer's son had blood cancer, but Mike was the only bone marrow match in the country. At first Mike flatly refused the transplant, but thinking about his plan to escape from prison, he agreed anyway. But Mike made two conditions to the officer. One, that he be allowed to smoke. The second was that he would be allowed to use the prison library. These were not too much to ask. The officer, who was determined to save his son, immediately agreed. And sure enough, the guards soon brought Mike cigarettes. Unbeknownst to him, this was just a false sense of confusion for Mike. He went to the prison library, and when the guards weren't looking, he secretly downloaded the hospital structure. After studying the structure of the hospital, he got a bottle of anti-anesthetic. He obtained a bottle of anesthetic antibiotics, tied a rope around the bottle and swallowed it into his esophagus. He took out a flint and hid it under his fingernails. Soon after, he was arranged to be taken to hospital, as the person was in danger. The police took it very seriously. Next door to the hospital was an old building. The police used it as a temporary prison. After the operation, Mike would be pressed into service and taken to the prison. In order to prevent Mike from escaping, Mike was escorted out of the car, but when the dogs saw him, they didn't even dare to search him. When they arrived at the hospital, Mike even greeted the officers because he had a bottle of pills in his esophagus. He didn't sound right when he spoke, but the officer was too anxious to save his son to take it seriously. During the operation, the doctor asked that the handcuffs be removed, otherwise the bone marrow could not be extracted from the tailbone. There was no choice. The police had to uncuff him and put him down. He slowly adjusted the position of his fingers. The anesthetist was about to start the anesthetic, but then something unexpected happened. The prisoner was seen wriggling his throat, biting down on the bottle of medicine in his mouth. The doctor soon realized that something was wrong. The maximum dose of anesthetic had been administered, but Mike hadn't lost consciousness. The police were about to step in to check on him. Mike had already withdrawn his hand. Suddenly his eyes opened. He threw up his leg and kicked him. The officer rushed from the door. Mike had already pulled out the air tube next to him. He used a flint hidden under his fingernails to light the oxygen. The operating theater was in chaos. It turns out that Mike was taking advantage of his time in the hospital to complete his escape plan. He spits the pieces out of his mouth. Then he turned and ran, grabbed two starters, and drilled into the ventilation duct. He made it to the laundry room, put on a white coat. When the officers came looking for him, he was nowhere to be found. Turns out Mike had crawled back through the ventilation ducts, pretending to be a doctor. He boldly walked to the radiology department. He threatened the doctor with a knife and used a laser gun to fire the shackles. Then he ran to the emergency room. He was going to operate on himself without anesthetic. He took the shrapnel out of his thigh. Then he stitched up the wound with a needle. Pain was excruciating. Mike soon infiltrated the ward again. He took a female doctor hostage. The police arrived shortly afterwards, but Mike didn't panic. He played a psychological game. He told the officers, if he died, the bone marrow would be useless. Your son wouldn't be able to live either. The officer was convinced, threw his gun on the ground, afraid that his colleague would shoot Mike. The officer even took cover, but the sound of the walkie-talkie, the police officer behind the curtain, was exposed. Mike raised his hand and fired several shots, killed two officers in front of and behind him. He never thought he would get his colleagues killed. The officers were at a loss for words. He watched as Mike fled. Then the chief arrived. He asked the officer in anger, "How many more people do you want to kill your son?" The officer was then relieved of his duties. On the other hand, Mike took the female doctor to the storage room. He ordered the doctor to bring him cyclopropane. This gas is very explosive. In the interval between bending down to get the canister, she suddenly hit Mike on the head and then hit him in the leg. She picked up the pistol and ran away. Mike Wells didn't go after her. He had other plans. Fierce Mike grabbed the can straight away, spilling the liquid all over the floor. The officer chased him to the door, told him to surrender, but Mike didn't listen. He was going to blow up the storage room to short-circuit the hospital's electricity so that he could escape, but the police were already downstairs. Mike had no choice but to go to plan B. He climbed over the barbed wire fence. He smashed through the glass window in the door, but the police at the bottom of the building spotted him. They were shooting wildly at him. That's when the officer arrived. One shot shattered the searchlight. He managed to save Mike. With a breather, Mike made his way to the prison. He took the warden hostage with acid. He made his way to the prison's main control room. The guards were all on the floor when they saw the scene. Mike handcuffed the warden and the guards together. At this point, he saw the officers climbing the barbed wire fence from the surveillance. He had no choice but to. Mike used his computer to operate the fence and blocked off the only entrance. There was no choice. Mike had no choice but to follow a predetermined route. Move the locker. He took out his fire axe, hammering away at it. In no time at all, a hole was created. He ran down the drain, moved the manhole cover and escaped. Then he grabbed a car. He was feeling the freedom he'd long felt, but then the officer drove after him. He came to a fork in the road. Mike slammed the steering wheel. The two of them parted ways. The officer was a tough guy too. Chased him down the hill. He came to a bridge. The barricade suddenly went up. Mike's car was soon stopped when Mike didn't give up. So the police officer posed as the chief, ordered the bridge to be raised. At that moment, the chief arrived in a helicopter. Mike saw the situation was not good. He took out his gun and opened fire. The officer tried to keep Mike from getting hurt. He took the bullet from his colleague. Mike didn't care about that, pushed the officer away and tried to jump off the bridge. In the heat of the moment, the officer shot him in the leg. Watching Mike fall, he jumped with him. Mike, who was still alive, was rescued from the river. He was touched by the officer's persistence. He finally agreed to a bone marrow transplant. Mike came back to the hospital. He cooperated with the doctors and had a successful transplant. He was relieved to see his son back in good health. The officer was relieved. Mike looked very weak. He was talking incessantly. The police officer next to him leans over. A cold gun is pointed at him. He's been played again by Mike. It looks like his escape plan has begun again. Will Mike still be able to escape? We'll have to wait and see.